Thank you for joining us for the second part of the Risk GovCon podcast, where I'm joined by our expert guest, Ben Brooks of Beryllium InfoSec Collaboration, as we continue our exploration of the NIST 800-171 regulations. In today's Part 2 show, Ben brings techniques to the table as we uncover ways to tackle NIST and simplify the process. For the Risk GovCon podcast, I'm your host, Brian Smith. Hello, welcome back. This is Brian Smith, your host for Risk GovCon, sponsored by Risk Reconnaissance, LLC. And again, I'm Brian Smith, your host. Today, we're continuing a conversation with Ben Brooks from Beryllium InfoSec Collaborative out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Ben comes by way of a cyber security background. He's also former military with many years in the Navy, and he's still active in the Naval Reserve. And we're happy to have him in our studios today as we're going into the second segment of our series on cybersecurity, and in particular NIST 800-171. So welcome back, Ben.
Hey, thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.
It's good having you back in the studios. We ended the last series on talking about what is NIST 800-171, and now we wanted to reach in and say, what are some of the things you've seen as a cybersecurity specialist, and what are some landmines that companies that are in the government contracting space can avoid?
We've seen everything from soup to nuts, if everybody's familiar with that expression. We've seen small businesses who absolutely positively could not do this on their own, trying to figure it out. And then we've seen very large businesses who simply have to tweak what they already have in place in order to make sure that they have met the compliance requirements. So the most common thing is that we find these mid-sized businesses or these larger small-sized businesses that just can't determine what the right path is for them, whether they're going to do it themselves or whether they're going to hire somebody to help them out with it. And very few people realize that there really is a 100% solution out there. And again, that's what Beryllium started out to do. So we've seen a lot.
Well, you know, when we were talking before, when we had our break, we stepped out for a bit, and we wanted to talk a little bit about this segment here. And you mentioned to us, without naming names, let's just call it Company X. Mm-hmm. And it was a story that you had shared with me about this is how we led to this. What have you seen? And there was, you mentioned it before, the do-it-yourself, the tried, the failed, and how they solved that issue. So it's almost like making something out of trash. You know, that they've done it wrong. It takes so much more effort to fix it. It's like doing a bad push-up. It takes the same amount of effort, but it doesn't look good, and it doesn't do you any good.
And you don't get any gains.
That's right. So let's talk about that. Like, let's just go back to that story we talked about in the hallway, that Company X. So why don't you go ahead and let the audience know about that?
Sure. We got approached by an organization who said, yeah, we definitely need to be NIST 800-171 compliant. And we always start with that, right? Because we don't want to start anybody down this path if they don't actually need to do it. So what we did was we determined, yep, you're absolutely right, you do have to do this. And so we started down a traditional route, which starts with a security assessment. And we said to them, what do you have in place? How are you operating it? Show us your programmatic standpoint from all this. What's the security posture of the organization? Mm-hmm. And we took a couple of days to assess what's going on and what they have. And we said, okay, here's the gaps between where you are right now and where you need to go to achieve this NIST 800-171.
How'd they take that? I mean, was it an eye-awakening experience, so to speak?
It was, and in fact, it was kind of funny because the IT professional there, just a fantastic guy, really sharp, and really wanted to do this and do it the right way. He was harder on himself than I was on him. I'm like, no, man, you got this and you got that. You did it right there. We just have to catalog it now. That's all. He's like, oh, okay. Cool.
Is it safe to say that this person left his ego at the door and was willing to accept where the gaps rested? Or because we see it, I've seen it both ways, where they own it, it's their program, and they get defensive. So how did this person handle it?
Well, again, his longing to make sure it was done correctly really overcame any ego. He said, I just don't know. And so, he relied on our expertise to verify that for him.
So this was the do-it-yourself group?
Yep. And then afterwards, they decided that they were going to go ahead and try and implement all of those controls. And in the end, a year later, they found that it was just too much. And this is the organization that we teamed with to find those statistics of, well, how many man hours did you put into this? And we came up with the 2,000 person hours per year just to manage this program.
That seems like a lot. We had covered that number earlier, and it's still staggering to me that it would take that much effort to do something that, for all intents and purposes, is required. Scares probably a lot of people in our audience today when it comes to just trying to overcome this hurdle. And then you got a company that tried it. They did their best. They had a tremendous number of gaps present. The IT professional looked at it, was humbled. They tried. They, I guess you can call it, for all intents and purposes, failed. How they solved that?
Well, they eventually came back to us and said, look, guys, do you have a solution for us? And we said, well, yeah, absolutely. We have our 100% solution. It addresses all 110 controls in the 14 family groups of the NIST 800-171. So if you guys would like to look at that, absolutely. And so ultimately, they ended up actually putting their entire organization into this environment, which is pretty great. It implemented security above and beyond what they might need for their regular daily practices, but better safe than sorry, right?
Gotcha. In case you're just joining us, this is Brian Smith with Risk GovCon, sponsored by Risk Reconnaissance, and we are bringing to you a podcast for government defense contractors that involve risk, business development, and contractual compliance. Just trying to make your job and your profession all the better with some great information. And with me today, again, is Ben Brooks from Beryllium InfoSec Collaborative out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. As a government contracting executive, have you ever found yourself training your insurance broker on your government contracting operations so they might get the right coverage you really need? Who's working for who? It may be time to consider the professionals with Risk Reconnaissance. Our unique blend of military experience, coupled with a deep understanding of risk and insurance, creates a client experience that is second to none. We understand a wide variety of GovCon considerations. You see, we embrace OCONUS operations, the multiple contract opportunities your team prepares for, and the time-sensitive delivery of workers' compensation rates needed to complete your proposals. Interested in learning more? Visit our website, theriskrecon.com. That's THERISKRECON.com for more details and to start a conversation. With Risk Reconnaissance, it's simple. You support the warfighter, we support you. And right now we're in the middle of talking about a company that made an attempt to do the NIST 800-171 compliance project. And after Ben's company took a look at it, they discovered a lot of pitfalls, a lot of issues, and then we're getting into how they fixed it. So, Ben, back to you on how they solve it. When they hired you, they talked to your firm, or it could be any firm for all that matters. What had to happen? I mean, how did you fix it?
Well, for this organization, again, they had dedicated themselves to doing it on their own from the outset. And by doing it on their own, I mean the implementation, right? Before we had talked about making sure there's no collusion of the security and the IT element. So again, we don't have that fox guarding the henhouse scenario. So we advised them on the best course of action and heck, even free technologies that they can implement to make this happen. And ultimately, it just came down to they didn't have the person hours and they didn't want to make that spend to do it and maintain it themselves. Now, we also had a company, Y, who came to us and we started out the same way. We said, well, you're not in the boat that the 100% done for you solution is probably your best course of action. For you, Company Y, it's probably best that you go ahead and do it yourself. And they said, great. and they went out and hired that security professional, and they did all of those things that we said. Here's your prescription. Here's how you fix it, right? And they started that implementation, and they're well on their way. So it goes both ways, right?
You know, if you look across the table at me as a CXO, any level, because that's who's really listening to us today, you would say, Mr. Smith, this is what you need to consider when you're looking at this compliance. Finish that sentence.
Okay. And this is really a business decision, Mr. Smith. You need to determine whether this is right for your organization, whether you're going to get the juice out of the squeeze from these contracts such that you need to make this spend to get that profit, to get that revenue.
And because of that, it's going to be compliant, and they're not going to have a chance to really, I guess the detriment would be to lose the contract or lose the ability to even bid on contracts if they're not compliant.
Right, exactly.
When you talk to, what, in your opinion, what percentage of, that's a hard question, but I'll throw it at you. How many people are compliant? How many companies do you estimate are compliant, percentage-wise?
So there's actually, it's a great question, and there's two aspects to look at this. First is compliance, and the second is implementation. In the first episode, we talked a little bit about what it means to be compliant, but we didn't make that distinction between compliant and implemented. So compliance, you could be compliant with a 0% implementation as long as you have your system security plan and your POAM in place, but you must be actively working towards 100% implementation, and you only have a year once you say, okay, here's my SSP and my POAM, and I'm going to make this happen. Can some organizations do it in a year? Some organizations could implement this stuff in 3 months, but they would be some pretty large organizations. So what we're looking at here is compliance versus implementation, and that 100% implementation is required by the end of your POAM's useful life, and you have to redo that POAM. And if you've made significant progress, you're okay. But you have to make significant progress. We're talking at least 15%. So to answer your question, how many are actually compliant? I would say probably about 50% have a compliant status. But how many have a 100% implementation? It's abysmal. It's
So then
very small.
If you're a listener out there, ask yourself this question: how confident are you that your organization is compliant with NIST 800-171? And some of those answers that you may be thinking about are hard to fathom, but it needs to be considered. The risk not only is for the success of your organization, but Ben said it earlier, it's about information security that could bring a tremendous problem, loss to our country. And so the relevance here goes beyond just the business scope. And it's something that needs to be considered. And with the changing landscape of cyber and technology, it changes so often. This is something people never had to consider 20 years ago. Even though 20 years ago there was still infiltration, computer systems. But we didn't know about ransomware, malware, the term rogue employee. You know, they were taking paper copies out of the Xerox room, right? And that was in their own way espionage. Now we're looking at somebody thousands and thousands of miles away in front of a green or blue screen having at it.
That's right.
So as we wrap this segment up here on what have you seen, if you don't mind telling me one of the worst stories that you've seen from non-compliance so far. Just if you don't mind just sharing that with us, and we'll go ahead and wrap this up.
One of the worst stories was that, we're too small. This, you guys are just trying to scare us to do all of this stuff. Well, I can show you the actual law requirements. This isn't a scare tactic. This is just the requirement for being a custodian or a steward of this information on your systems. And they eventually, basically, because of their belligerent attitude, really is what it came down to with their prime contractor, they went out of business. They said they weren't going to do it.
So it ultimately just it was their demise.
It was. And I don't want to doom and gloom everybody on this stuff.
Right.
It's absolutely achievable. But the fact of the matter is, it's not a hairy homeowner, Home Depot do-it-yourself project. The best thing to do is get advice from a professional who can help you with all 110 of those controls. Don't try and piecemeal it, because that's kind of do-it-yourself. Make sure that somebody can help you the entire way through.
If you've lasted for the first two segments up to this point, that's what we're going to talk about in our third episode. My name is Brian Smith. I'm the host of Risk GovCon, brought to you by Risk Reconnaissance. And we talk about a variety of topics, issues, and business concerns for government and defense contractors. And joined by Ben Brooks today, Beryllium InfoSec Collaborative out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we hope to hear you or have you join our final segment that we're getting ready to do. Thank you. Remember to join us for our upcoming second episode of the Risk GovCon podcast as we continue tackling the myth of NIST compliance with our expert guest, Ben Brooks of Beryllium InfoSec Compliance. Until then, I'm your host, Brian Smith.